Why is this car so heavy? No. Just make sure I don't steer off into oblivion.
Why are you pushing and not driving?
Why? Because I have sand in my feet. There, is that good?
Yeah.
The forgotten S-Class, the W116. Why is it when we think of the Mercedes S-Class, we either think of the W126 or the W108? Why is it that most people who are Mercedes Benz enthusiasts have completely forgotten about this car? I have a couple of ideas, and maybe there are some redeeming qualities in the 116, or maybe it was just totally outdone by the W126 and the W108. We're going to explore that theory today. Now, here is a really nice example of a 116. This is one of my personal cars. It's a 1980, November of '79 production, so 1980 model year, 300 SD. This was the last 116 that was ever pushed through development, and it was the first Mercedes-Benz with the turbo diesel OM617 engine. This was such a revolutionary car, not only because it proved that turbocharging the diesel engine was the way to go for passenger cars. I mean, think of a diesel without a turbo today. They don't exist. But it also breathed life back into the 116 platform and revived demand for this model. But does the 116 alone stand on its own merits without the addition of this excellent engine? Let's start by exploring the car first. When people say that a Mercedes door closes like a bank vault, I think this is what they mean. Even though a lot of 116s have kind of sticky door latches, I can't think of a car where the doors close more perfectly than on this model platform. There's no slamming like you have to do with a 126 or a 123 when the door strikers wear out. Second of all, regardless of how you feel about them, the 116 contained three design elements that I think really made this a distinct car. First of all, they went from upright headlamps and an upright headlamp design to a horizontal headlight design. And this is something you admittedly saw first on the 107, which was iconic in its own right, but later on it became the hallmark feature of the 116, where it departed from all other S-classes. Now, I'm sure you guys are wondering where this Harley-Davidson tag came from. We'll talk a little bit more in short order about this car's specific history. But the 116 definitely had some other interesting design elements that are either love or hate. Now, US cars had these giant bumpers. Now, people love to complain about the giant bumpers on the 116. And the 107 and the 115, and people go, oh, what ugly bumpers. Well, my comment to most of those people is, who cares? It's a high quality bumper that does a damn good job when there is a major impact. If you are sitting in one of these cars and somebody hits you, and they're not in some monster SUV, they're in a passenger car, a smaller SUV. If they hit you going 45 miles an hour, the bumper absorbs most of the impact without damaging the actual car. I would much rather look at an ugly bumper than look at a totaled car. That's the long and short of it. Now, a third design feature of these cars, where they differ from other Mercedes-Benz of the era, happens to do with the model profile of the body. Mercedes sedans generally had very tall fenders. They were not rounded off aerodynamically. They had a look of high and mightiness, some sort of prominence where you felt like you were driving in a very upright, very angular position. This car began to shed Mercedes' image of upright angularity so that it became a more sleek, a more polished, a more rounded, and more visually unobtrusive design. Now, when I say visually unobtrusive, I mean it blends in better. If you see a W110, a 108, a 115, the cars don't blend in as well. You're like, there's a Mercedes. There it is. I've had, until they see the star in the grill, I've had a lot of people who know a thing or two about Mercedes go, what kind of Mercedes is that? I know it's a Mercedes, but I don't know which one. Is it a 123? Is it a 126? Is it a 115? Is it some kind of weird four-door SL? Not really. But what the 116 did incredibly well was capture the styling panache of the sleekness of the 107 and the roominess and spaciousness of a 115 and sort of expand on those designs and create a design language that was able to be translated forward onto the 123, which is over there, and even into the 126. And in fact, there were mock-ups as early as 75 of the 116 being updated into the 126. Now, structurally, the 116 had a number of other merits, and this is going to be easier for me to talk about because I'm a technical guy. I'm not a car designer. I've never been into that sort of thing. The 116 utilized the rear suspension of the 115 almost perfectly. It expanded on this on the double CV axle setup with the trailing wishbone suspension and the rigidly mounted the flexibly mounted 3-point of attachment rear subframe. Up in front though, unlike the 115 and 107, it used the suspension system that took Mercedes-Benz passenger cars all the way up to 1991 on the 126, and arguably the best suspension system ever used in a Mercedes. This is the system that uses the infamous hard to press in unless you have the special tool lower ball joint that's integrated into the steering knuckle. It also uses an independent single radius upper control arm that's made completely of lightweight aluminum. It's not like the heavy stamped steel double radius upper control arm on a 450 SL or 115 series car. The suspension in these cars was quick and easy to service. Parts were affordable, yet at the same time it yielded amazing riding and driving characteristics that you've just never seen before. I can't talk highly enough about how well engineered this car was, but the one thing about the 116 that really makes the design ultra rigid is the addition, and it's kind of hard to see, but right here, going all the way across to the other side, going all the way across to the other side is what I call the best damn torsional stabilizer bar I've ever seen. It's not a cute little aluminum bar like you see under the hoods of Jettas. It's not a flat piece of metal like you see on a 126. This thing looks like an oil pipe, something they'd pipe oil out of the ground with, because it's about this big. And it is heavy. If you hit somebody with this bar, you will probably cause severe brain damage. And this whole thing goes right between point A and the A pillar across the bottom of the car to point B to eliminate cowl shake, to eliminate any chassis flexibility, and in case some idiot decides to hit you, because let's say it's 1977 and they've had too many cognacs or too many whatever other people drink, I don't know, rum and coke or whatever, and they're driving their 20-foot long Lincoln Mark V through a stop sign at 40 miles an hour and they just happen to hit you, you would probably walk away. Just because this bar would keep the entire cabin structure from folding in. And this is where a lot of people, I think, don't understand what the 116 is. The 116 was not really meant to be this snob appeal kind of ritzy looking Mercedes, although it did spawn a lot of imitators. And in the next section of this video, we're going to make fun of some of those imitators from the period and see just how miserably they failed. Actually, where the 116 came from was a desire at Mercedes-Benz to make the most, I would say probably the safest, most reinforced and rigid vehicle that they possibly could. They were trying to make the accident-proof car that not only concentrated all of the car's strength around and inside the passenger compartment, but also allowed the driver to be able to make rapid fire changes to their direction or braking or steering that wouldn't result in the car just spinning out of control. Now, these were some shortcomings that had to be addressed on older Mercedes like the W108 platform. And we're going to get in here and we're going to explore some of the structural merits of the 116 chassis so that you can see what we're talking about. Now, the predecessor to the 116 was definitely the 115, but not a standard 115. There was a vehicle made called the Experimental Safety Vehicle. And this ESV, or Experimental Safety Vehicle, was based on the 250 sedan. These experimental safety vehicles were developed alongside the 116 so that as improvements in crash testing and rigidity were implemented in the ESV, they could be translated into the 116 to make it a better, more effective, and much safer car. At the same time, Mercedes was attempting to get the vehicle's overall body mass under control so that it didn't use quite so much fuel, which is something that I think they failed miserably at, but we could talk about that later. In fact, this is really the only economical version of the W116. The rest of them rarely get fuel mileage in the 20s. We'll go there later though. Now, what do I mean about this car being so safe and so rigid? Well, first of all, and by the way, I know my hood pad isn't attached. Just ignore that for now. It's actually in the trunk. The adhesive didn't hold up. It was too modern and pathetic. But these cars didn't use a thin inner fender. You can see that this is an extremely structurally sound bulkhead. All of this is heavy stamped steel, probably akin to the same thickness as the B-pillar. So right around here where the wheelhouse is, we already have a significant structural improvement over other Mercedes. The 108 had steel about half this thick in key high points of the substructure. Now, there were other improvements that were made too. For example, this double bulkhead, which consists in some areas of overlapped heavy sheet metal panels, ensured that the cabin would stay absolutely safe even if it was hit by a truck. Finally, the bumper shock absorbers were completely integrated into the front structural rails, such as the front bumper shock absorber would not only deliver an impact to the front cross member, but the impact would be absorbed right inside the frame rail itself. Such that the impact would be absorbed by the frame rail itself in addition to the bumper shock. Prior to that, Mercedes-Benz model involved a front impact being completely absorbed by the entire front crumple zone of the car. That meant that if somebody hit you and tapped your bumper, you could be in the market for an entirely new front end if it was whacked out of alignment because they were so fragile and sensitive. This thing was not as fragile and sensitive as a car. And in fact, it could take a much greater impact than a W108 series could. There are some other cues though about the 116 that you may not notice as readily. For example, all the taillights and the taillights and the side marker lights were ribbed to brush away dirt, which is something that some of you might know, but others may not. Another thing was the color. A lot of these cars were sold in light ivory, particularly towards the end of production. Now, this example is petrol blue metallic. Petrolblau in German. Petrolblau is an extremely rare color on these cars, but the majority of dealers had to accept a certain number of light ivory cars. Why light ivory? So many people don't like light ivory. Well, it's because it's safe. You can see it. You can see it under all circumstances. Rain, dark, snow, whatever. Light ivory is apparently the most visible color that Mercedes-Benz ever produced. Now, if you look at certain other structural key points, such as the car's B-pillars and rocker panels, you'll see that these rocker panels are incredibly wide. They're not like the skinny little rocker panel on a 115, which was okay, but instead they're sort of like the rocker panel that you'd find, you know, on maybe a later, newer Mercedes like the 140 or even to an extent the 126, which got its idea of a wide rocker panel here. All of this area is designed to absorb impact. This entire door frame, and it's a very strong door frame too. Same thing with the roof. Look at these giant wide A-pillars. Probably the biggest, strongest A-pillars put on any car that was not a 107. If you go here and look at the back of the car, you see that they have this massive trunk. Now the trunk is in and of itself. Don't think of it as just a big trunk. Think of it as a crumple zone. This entire thing right here, this entire space, is designed to absorb ludicrous amounts of impact. This is the kind of car where if you are stuck between two semis and one is stopped and one can't stop, this is the car you want to be in. This is probably one of the few Mercedes on the road today where you can say that you would totally and without any question walk away from a crash that was not caused by some sort of petroleum fire. Now, does that mean I want people to try to get in an accident in their 116s? Absolutely not, because they're not making anymore. But for those of us that understand that car accidents are something we're not supposed to be in, even if it's somebody else's fault, they made some other things that help. Mercedes' key emphasis in the 116 was on the car's maneuverability. That's why they worked so hard to fine-tune the suspension, the steering, the braking system. This car will swerve out of the way at 70 miles an hour and make a pinpoint lane change, like a sudden sort of immediate snap of the fingers lane change under heavy braking. And if you have good tires and it's not too wet outside, you will probably maintain control of the car. This is also the kind of car where if you wanted to do a handbrake turn or drive like a complete idiot through the streets of Paris at speeds of over 100 miles an hour plus, this is your ride. If some of you have watched the movie C'était un Rendezvous, you'll understand that the car used in that film was not a Ferrari. The Ferrari was just a soundtrack. It was a 6.9. Why? Because the 6.9 is one of the few cars that you can drive at such insanely high speeds. It's such a big car in such a tight space where you can make split-second decisions to brake or turn or brake or stop or reverse or even swing the car all the way around. What other car from the 70s with 4 doors could do this? I can attest that even these 300 SDs, even when we get them in with totally worn out suspension systems and tired braking systems still drive and handle better than most new economy compact cars or even mid-size cars for that matter. And it's not just because they're a big heavy car. It's because they were engineered to put every single thing that Mercedes-Benz had learned at the time to use. We're going to save this for a little bit later. Now, what did the imitators try to accomplish? It became very clear in the 1970s that this was the car to beat and this was the car to have. In 1974, Ford came out with the Elite, which was just like a Granada. And what did they do to try to get people to be more interested in the Ford Elite? Well, they told their competitors that it was just like a Mercedes 280S. That sounds really believable, doesn't it? How about we take this carbureted overhead valve behemoth with, for all intents and purposes, a gas-guzzling 6-cylinder engine, a 3-speed automatic, oh, and really comfortable seats that will give you back problems after you ride in them for the next 2 or 3 years. But don't worry, you'll trade it in 12 months anyway, because it's designed to be traded in every 12 months, and say that it's a better value for the money than the 280S. Most people saw right through that ad and decided right then and there that maybe they should just spend the extra few $1,000s in a Mercedes. Why wouldn't you? Unfortunately, the 116 also had its share of problems. This was an emissions era Mercedes. This was such a comfortable and spacious car that a large man of such great stature as myself can easily and quickly recline the seat and have a relaxing nap on his drive to wherever he's going, even if it's 5 or 10 hours away, because it is a Mercedes. Unfortunately, though, as comfortable and safe as these cars were, there was something else that caused a few problems for them, and that was the US emissions era. See, the emissions era was one of those things where everything that we had known about automobiles and everything we had done to refine them and make them as good as they could possibly be had to be thrown out the window because we needed to make them run cleaner and more efficiently. Well, they definitely ran cleaner. They ran so clean that most of these emissions era cars did not even have to generate any exhaust gases after 100,000 miles, providing an amazing carbon offset because they usually just didn't run. There's a dearth of low mileage 1974, 75, and 76 116S classes out there, particularly 280Ss, and maybe a few 280SEs from 77 and 78, because the cars just did not perform as well as people expected them to. Maybe we could get a shot of me from back here.
Yeah, it looked really funny when you could see you in the back, like all the window.
Unfortunately, until the 300SD arrived, these cars were underpowered, with the 280S making only 115 horsepower as Mercedes' crown jewel in its CAFE regulation fleet. On the other hand, the 450 SE by 1975 was relegated down to 160 horsepower. And even then, because of the giant trap oxidizers in the cylinder head and the low amount of stress on these engines, did not guarantee that they were going to run and drive as smoothly and nicely as their W108 predecessor did. In fact, these cars were so bogged down with emissions equipment and weird vacuum functions and settings that most mechanics looked at them and didn't even want to touch them. They just tell the owner to live with it or go deal with it or go get another car. And most people who had Mercedes at the time were wealthy enough so that they just trade the cars in. As a result, there are very few gasoline Mercedes from the 116's heyday in 1974, 75, and 76 floating around out there. Starting in 1977, Mercedes-Benz began honestly developing a turbo diesel engine for passenger car production. The concept of turbocharging the OM617 had been proven by a number of extensive tests in the C111 prototypes, resulting in the OM617 being able to drive steadily at 190 miles an hour around the Nardo circuit while generating well over 10 miles per gallon. That's a big feat because driving a car 190 miles an hour is usually not a very efficient way to test a vehicle. But the engine not only survived, it also thrived at these speeds, with post-test disassembly showing very little wear and tear since Mercedes had beefed up the engine internals with better lubrication and cooling. These lessons were applied to the OM617.950, which was released in the 300 SD to satisfy CAFE regulations for the North American market in February of 1978. Now you ask, why February of 78? Well, we looked and looked and looked, and over the years we have compiled a list of some of the earliest production 300 SDs we could find. And the oldest example we saw was built in February of 78, and its serial number was below number 100. So it was such an early production car that it was in the first batch of 100 cars, and it was built in February of 1978. Thankfully, Mercedes development paid off, and the 116 300 SD, otherwise known as the 116 120, was a strong seller all the way through to the end of its production run in August of 1980, when it was already being replaced by the 126 300 SD. The 126 300 SD went on to become a runaway sales success, probably becoming the most sought after diesel S-Class until some of the more modern products appeared. But nothing would have ever nothing would have ever changed if it wasn't for this car. The 300 SD was so different from other 116s because it was fuel efficient. It was extremely reliable because it had no injection system computer or no electric fuel pump or no distributor with ignition points and spark plug wires and an ignition coil. Its reliability was off the charts. It just had a simple mechanical pump, an injection pump, and a turbocharger, and it was able to outperform its own counterpart, the 280 SE, both in terms of fuel economy, 0 to 60 time, and even get very close in top speed with a mile per hour difference of something like 5 miles per hour between the two. In fact, the 280 SE was so much like the 300 SD that it started this policy at Mercedes of diesels eventually replacing gas cars. And this was really the de facto policy at Mercedes-Benz until 1985. I'm not saying the gasoline product from that era was bad. I'm just saying it was so good that most people who liked Mercedes would have rather had a diesel. Even because diesels do things like make noise, and diesel smell has a unique smell, which by the way is less obtrusive than gasoline. Just letting you know. That they decided that the diesel model was the better model. Do I agree with them 40 years later? Well, Jerry Seinfeld recently said on a podcast where he mentioned that he does watch my channel, that I am out to dieselize the entire world. I don't know if that's true. I still like gasoline Mercedes a lot, and I have a bunch of them. But I will say that these diesels are a pretty amazing car, and you can't go wrong by getting one. Now let's look at some other features of the 116. So the 116 standardized a number of features that were very important features starting out in the starting in 1973 with its production, and eventually progressing to become a more equipment-laden car as it was developed further. What did 116s come with? Well, in the United States, by the end of production, they came with, Nick, I need you here. In the United States, by the end of production, they came with cruise control, which is what this cable here does. They came with automatic climate control, which is what this servo thing does right here that I've talked about in some of my other videos. They came with fog lights, not standard on the 115 and 114 unless you paid the big bucks and got a 280C or something. They also came with pressurized windshield wiper squirters. For those of you that are not aware of this fact, the 115 was still using a foot pump at the time of production. They also came, at least if you had a 300 SD, with an aluminum hood. A car with an aluminum hood. Only Italian sports cars had aluminum hoods. Most of these cars had a sunroof, although this one was a sunroof delete car. It also has an aluminum trunk lid. How amazing. Now, not all 116s had that equipment, but these things were so specced out with their light alloy wheels. I mean, most of the time, let's just, as an aside here, most American cars at the time did not have alloy wheels. They had these big, ugly, giant, ugly stamped steel wheels that were cheap to produce, that usually had a heavy wheel cover, where you couldn't tell the difference whether the wheel was on somebody's rape van or whether it was on a police car. There was no way to be able to tell. They were just big, ugly stamped steel wheels. The Mercedes stamped steel wheels at the time, by the way, had cooling holes for the brakes. So nobody say anything. You have nothing you can talk about there. But these beautiful little light alloy butt wheels were the first of their kind. Another great feature of this car was its standard vacuum locking system, which on this car doesn't work and I have yet to repair, but that's fine. How about an electric antenna with your Becker Europa stereo? Or what about a limited slip differential in case you needed one of those? That was optional as well. And some dealers would even install an extra fuel tank for you so that you could drive, instead of going 500 miles in a tank of diesel, you could drive 1,000 miles. I knew people that had 116 turbo diesels with extra fuel tanks that were able to drive basically up the entire eastern seaboard on one tank of fuel. There's some other nice things about this car too that I want to point out. For example, this was one of the last Mercedes to use chrome instead of anodized aluminum. A lot of these pieces on the car, these bright trim pieces, not so much the window framing, but some of these items like the badging or the trunk handle or these wraparound bumpers, these are still chrome. They're not cheap anodized aluminum that gets cloudy and gross. The amount of money that was expended to develop and build a 116 passenger car would cause the amount of money that was required to develop and build a 116 passenger car would probably equate to somewhere around $250,000 to $300,000 today, because this level of workmanship has basically been cost effectively destroyed by the building model of most modern cars. This car was effectively built out of enough steel to build 3 or 4 Kias today. Maybe 1.5 new Mercedes. Not sure. So if these cars are so great and so wonderful, why is it that nobody likes them? Well, there are 3 reasons that the 116 has not succeeded as well in the marketplace. The first one is because the cars often got ravaged by rust. Certain parts of the car, such as the sunroof pan, the bottoms of the front fenders, the firewall underneath the fuse box, the areas under the front and rear windshields, and even some chassis and structural support areas, such as the area under the battery, would get absolutely destroyed by rust and corrosion. Rust and corrosion from these areas could effectively render a car like this totally unusable, not only compromising their safety in an accident, but also making them really unattractive. Mercedes discontinued a lot of the structural parts for the 116, And so therefore, repairing one today requires either used parts, reproduction parts, which are difficult to source, or a high level of ingenuity in manufacturing replacement sheet metal. Another reason was because of some of the issues on the Malaise era 116 cars. These cars did not escape the Malaise era very effectively. If you watch channels like Rear Classic Cars or Ed's Auto Reviews, you'll see that there's a heavy discussion of what the Malaise era was. But basically, it was when all the auto manufacturers had to effectively kneecap their cars to make them more emissions friendly. Mercedes came out with the 116, 120, 300 SD to circumvent those issues. But for the gasoline cars, copious amounts of vacuum, giant thermal reactors, reduced compression engines with weak cam profiles, and of course, all sorts of options that were required to keep the cars current effectively held them back, causing them to have less power than their 108 predecessors. Similar fuel economy, although they didn't take premium at the time. Weird running characteristics that led to difficult starting, rough idle, difficulty to service, and a lot of frustration on behalf of the mechanics and the owners. And then finally, of course, the increasing cost of the cars, whereas they were fairly affordable in 73 and 74, and then inflation hit around 75 and 76 and 77, making new cars more unaffordable than ever, served to not only limit sales, but hurt resale value, effectively meaning that many 116s got run into the ground. There were other quality control issues too. It's no secret that the automatic climate control system that I pointed out earlier is very difficult to service and keep operating. Some other issues included the seats just going baggy and flat. And of course, dashboards that cracked, or wood that delaminated, or interior trim that just did not hold up, made people more excited than ever to buy the 126, which is a very high quality car, when it came out in 1981. This relegated a lot of 116s to the used car lots, meaning that only certain models of 116 were highly sought after and survived. And this is one of them. Try going out and finding a 450 SE or SEL. It's not that easy. They do exist, but they are not easy to find. If you go out and look for a 116, the two models you will find the most of are 300 SDs and 280Ss. 280Ss because they were so underpowered and they were so complex because of their Solex 4A1 carburetor when they were new that many did not accumulate high mileage and were pushed into garages where they would sit for 20 or 30 years until somebody would wake one up. These, because they were such good cars and they kept running, that their owners refused to get rid of them. Because who wouldn't want a car in the Malaise era that had no emission system to deal with? Who would want a car when every other car around you got 15 miles per gallon that got 25 miles per gallon? And of course, who wouldn't want a car where the maintenance involved fuel filters under the hood, an oil change, and a valve adjustment, as opposed to spend 10 hours trying to figure out where a major vacuum leak is, change the spark plugs, distributor cap, ignition module, fuel filter under the car, figure out why the ignition timing isn't retarded enough to make the car meet its emission standards. I mean, this is just a revelation in motoring at the time. Now we're going to talk briefly about this example, because I'm sure all of you are curious. I recently acquired this 300 SD from the son of its long-term owner. The car came from Ohio when it was new, but it did not spend any time outside. The original owner having driven it for only 3 or 4 years and then putting it away. His son purchased the car from him, and by the way, the original owner is still alive and is in his mid-90s. But his son purchased the car from him and cleaned it up, did some maintenance on it, and got it going again. What does that involve? Maybe a battery and some fuel filters on one of these guys. And of course, he took it home, and I started maintaining this car in 2013. One day I got a phone call where he asked me to buy the car. The initial response I had was, no, I don't want it. But after he asked me 3 or 4 more times and made me an offer I couldn't refuse, finally I said, you know what, I understand why you want me to have this car. I also understand that this is really a special car, so why not? So what exactly happened to this 116 over the course of its life? Well, it only accumulated 62,000 miles. I'd like to leave some of the stuff from the previous owners on to remember them. I don't ride Harley Davidson motorcycles, it's just that was his thing. He liked it. I also don't have a AAA membership, but that was his thing. He had a AAA membership, so period bumper stickers are kind of cool. The thing that really got me the most about this car, though, was its weird color combination. The petrol metallic with black MB Tex. I don't think another one of these exists. I've only seen one other petrol metallic 300 SD, because this is a color that you could only really get on 1980 models. And it was a special request color that you actually had to order off of a sheet at your Mercedes-Benz dealer and then wait for the car to be built. When they announced the new colors for 1980, it stunned even myself that you could get petrol on black, because it's one of those colors that you'd think Mercedes would not pair together, but apparently they allowed it. The truth about this car, though, is that whoever ordered it new may not have picked it up or collected it, and it went into dealer inventory, which is whereas Mr. DeCapity purchased the car from his local Mercedes dealership. I think the car may have been from Youngstown, Ohio, but I'd have to look at the records to remember. When I started working on this car, the only real major repair I had to do was the installation of a rack damper pin in the back of the injection pump to stabilize the idle, as well as the repair of the climate control system using the electronic climate control servo and some light vacuum repairs. I have to report that the climate control in this car works excellently. It's unbelievable. Under the hood is the famous OM617 turbo diesel. Mercedes made year-to-year changes on this engine that made the 1980 model year engines quite unique. For example, this engine is early enough in 1980 to where it does not have an EGR valve, but it's late enough to where it has the updated single line vacuum pump with the somewhat, well, we'll just call it extensive and confusing vacuum line network for the vacuum locks, the climate control, the turbo boost control, and the cruise control systems. So people look at these and go, oh, they are a little complicated, but it has some other stuff I love too. It still has its battery box cover. It still has the remnants of the antifreeze tag on the radiator vent hose. It still has its radiator sticker and its fan stickers. I will put the hood pad on at some point when I get time. As you guys know, I'm quite busy, but when I was changing the battery this morning, the hood pad fell down because somebody had used Elmer spray adhesive to attach it instead of the correct Mercedes adhesive. Just a little aside. But when we got this car, we had to make sure that there was not a single non-original hose clamp in it, and that all the service parts such as belts and filters were OEM specification, including genuine Mercedes belts, Hinkster man filters, and of course any part that we felt that the climate control system needed, like the AC pressure switch or new rubber bushings and a new air cleaner mount from Mercedes, got installed. So it was in condition you'd expect a 62,000 mile car to be in. Now, what do I personally think of the 116? Because I know some of you are going to ask. These cars are hit or miss in so many ways, but a few years ago I did a soft mechanical rehab and interior rehab on a 75 280S. And I'd say that even the most frustrating and difficult 1975 model year Malaise era 116 is still better than anything you can buy from Mercedes today. These cars have craftsmanship, build quality, and rigidity that you just do not see on any Mercedes built and designed in the mid-90s or later. It doesn't exist. On newer Mercedes, they simulate high quality build. They simulate carefulness and ride quality, and they simulate this feeling of you driving an upper class expensive car, but it's all a simulation. It's not anything more than skin deep. Sure, the leather feels nice, but the seats don't have heavy duty springs in them that are calibrated to the suspension. Sure, the buttons feel nice in the climate control, but they go to a gazillion little wires and they're made of synthetic materials that are going to fail over the years. So they lose that feeling. This car isn't like that at all. Even if you have to do things like redo the interior or refinish the wood, at the end of the day, it's still a high quality automobile. Even with the difficulties that restoring one of these cars entails, such as rebuilding the interior of the seats, replacing the dashboard, refinishing the wood, dealing with miles and miles of climate control vacuum, there is still a certain appeal that these cars carry over a modern Mercedes. For example, on a modern Mercedes-Benz, everything might be engineered to feel and look like it is high quality and that it has extremely detailed build quality, but the truth is that it's all surface level. The leather on the seats is just covered over cheap foam. The buttons in the dash look really nice and elegant with plastic chrome, but underneath you just have a cheap plastic button with a bunch of tiny little wires and materials that will eventually dissolve after 20 years. The 116 though is a different animal, because even with the dashboard out and the climate control not working and with the seats getting tired, once you take all that stuff apart and you start to study the car under its own skin, you see that underneath there is a really over-engineered car. A car where every single spot weld was accounted for by the factory to specific resistance. A car where the seat frame was designed to last you forever, even if you were a 350-pound alcoholic who rarely showered and was busy in their corporate office trying to put corporate buyouts together that most people would run away from. These cars were not really designed to be thrown away. They were designed to be repaired and repaired over and over again. And there's always a mechanical fix. Oftentimes with the mechanical systems, the worst thing you have to worry about is backdating the systems to their pre-1973 or 74 configuration when they were effective and made tons of power. For example, on an M110 engine, there was really not that much difference in the compression ratio. It was just the thermal reactor on the cylinder head that limited power so much. Meanwhile, on a 450 SE or SEL, the biggest problem with the exhaust systems we run into are failing thermal reactors that cause hot starting problems and fuel lines to disintegrate. Although we don't work on a lot of 75 model year cars, I can attest that the engines usually perform a lot better if they have 74 or earlier exhaust manifolds on them, or 1973 and earlier D-Jetronic computers and map sensors, which were designed to make the cars run better rather than to meet certain exhaust emissions criteria. Other parts of the 116 may not be so easy to fix, such as the rusty firewall or the sunroof pan. But you could still make the argument that spending $20,000 to $30,000 doing a cosmetic restoration on an otherwise nice car with a decent interior is still a better proposition than going out and buying a new Toyota Camry if you want a unique driving experience. And of course, there are the diesels. Most of these cars were so good that people just ran them into the ground. And what I see with a lot of older Mercedes diesels, just like with the 116 turbo diesel, the 126 turbo diesel, and the 123 turbo diesel, is that now people want great examples, but they don't want to do the work to restore a tired example. I am of the opinion that restoring a tired example is a noble pursuit if you can find the time and energy to undertake it and do the job right. Although it's a labor of love and often a task that results in much frustration and confusion until you get out of the woods and have a complete car. Anyway, I guess the question is, coming out of this 40 to 50-year-old period of Mercedes-Benz engineering, can we award the 116 with any accolades? Is it the safest Mercedes? Is it the sleekest S-Class? Is it the most beautiful S-Class? Is it the one that's most memorable? Is it the best bang for the buck because it's undervalued? Does it represent something to the average Mercedes enthusiast and aficionado of fine automobiles that you just don't see anymore? When we were growing up, my dad's friend John McNamara had a white 450 SEL that my dad used to work on. And I would look at that car and I'd say that that car exudes class. The car had so much class that you would assume that the person driving the car might be a Nobel Prize winner or a famous writer or a damn good attorney or a really good judge, a fair judge, or a great doctor. The 116 makes you come off as a much smarter, better, more intelligent person than you are. It's like a pair of bespoke shoes or a nice watch. It's one of those things where having one, especially a nice one, gives you a shred of credibility in a world where most people think that the guy next to them is stupider and more worthless and pathetic than they are. And maybe this is where the 116 hits its stride. While it may not be the most desirable S-Class, the most valuable S-Class, the most iconic S-Class, what it is the most sophisticated S-Class. And probably Are you ready, Nick? Turn the camera on.
ABS brakes.
Yeehaw! Okay, that's our B-roll shot. Yeehaw! While it may not be the most iconic S-Class, or the sexiest S-Class, or the most memorable S-Class, or the most valuable S-Class, I think it's the most sophisticated S-Class, and that's where the 116 shines. It's sophisticated because it was the first car with ABS brakes, or an airbag, or the first Mercedes with four-wheel hydraulic suspension in the 6.9, or the first turbo diesel. And this car basically owes us nothing in terms of what it has given automotive history. So it is probably one of the most sophisticated Mercedes, if not the most sophisticated S-Class ever. And that's why I'm proud to be a 116 owner, and why I consider the 116 to be a treasure in the Mercedes-Benz crown jewel heritage. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope you enjoy this channel. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you ever consider adopting a 116, I can help you find a car worthy of adoption so that more of them don't go to waste at the hands of fools and clowns. See you later, guys, and enjoy your own classic Mercedes.